Hello, and welcome to today's Revive webinar by the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership GARD-P. My name is Astrid Pence-Moore, and I'm hosting today's webinar on the challenges and opportunities for antimicrobial R&D in low and middle income countries, an India case study. Revive is GARD-P's education and outreach program. It aims to connect and support the antimicrobial R&D community by facilitating learning, sharing knowledge, and connecting people. These webinars are part of our educational activities. All our webinars are recorded and can be viewed a few days after the live broadcast on our website, revive.gardp.org/webinars. I encourage you to visit our website to stay up to date about future webinars and also to watch the recordings of more than 20 previous webinars. We also develop other content, such as our Antimicrobial Viewpoint series, where leading experts of different aspects of AMR are sharing their knowledge and opinions. As always, today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar via the questions window in your webinar control panel, as shown on this slide. We will address the questions after the final presentation, and we will do our best to address as many as possible. Today's webinar will be moderated by my colleague François Franceschi, who is the head of Asset Evaluation and Development and project leader of our new Serious Bacterial Infections program at GARD-P. Our speakers are Anandkumar from Bugworks and Kamini Walia from the Indian Council of Medical Research. Welcome, François. I now hand over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Astrid. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm really happy to introduce our speakers today. And first, I will introduce Dr. Kamini Walia. She has more than 20 years experience of working in public health and the public health space in India, and is really passionate about creating scientific projects with strong public health relevance. Kamini was trained at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She holds a PhD in experimental medicine and biotechnology, and she's working as a senior scientist in the Division of Epidemiology and Communicable Diseases of the Indian Council of Medical Research, the ICMR. Kamini has been working in a lot of different projects, including vaccines, diagnostics for the last 15 years, and all kind of projects that have a public health importance in the field of infectious diseases. Also, she works on reproductive and child health and non-communicable diseases. Kamini is currently steering the activities of ICMR, antimicrobial resistant research, surveillance and stewardship initiative that the ICMR is putting together, and also the diagnostics initiative. Very important is that Kamini established the first AMR surveillance network in India. And through her initiative, she has supported also numerous collaborations with different entities from pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, FINE for diagnostics, the Center for Disease Control in the USA, the Research Council of Norway, the National Institute of Infectious Diseases of Japan, and the NIH in the USA. So, and she also has been a technical coordinator of a program of global health security agenda in the CDC for reducing hospital-acquired infections in India. Kamini also worked a couple of years in PATH, which is a global nonprofit improving public health, to work on diagnostic access and health technologies. And also, most important, Kamini is a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of GARD-P, and we are really happy about that. And she is also a strategic advisor for the World Health Organization on in vitro diagnostics, and also on the group that tries to create the target profiles for AMR diagnostics. Yeah, I mean, we are really happy to have Kamini here. And please, Kamini, go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. And hello, everyone who have joined this very important webinar, which looks at the challenges and opportunities for antimicrobial R&D in low and middle income countries. Here, me and my colleague Anand will be presenting the India case study and how India, over a period of time, has evolved to encourage the antimicrobial related research and development in the country. Yeah, so I come from the Indian Council of Medical Research, which is the nodal body for steering the medical research in the country, the clinical, the basic, as well as the operational research. And I come from the Division of Epidemiology and Communicable Diseases division. So in the last few years, there has been a lot of focus on antimicrobial resistance and how it is evolving in the Southeast Asia, specifically India. There were initially reports of NDM as early as 2011, which brought a lot of focus on the antimicrobial resistance situation in India. And following that, there were a number of reports that reported that the ESBL genes, especially the NDMs and also the other multi-drug resistance genes, are often isolated from, initially isolated from a country like India, and then subsequently they are transmitted across the globe. So what makes India really a hotbed of drug-resistant infections, as we see from the evidence that emanates from the country? Now, India has a high burden of infectious diseases. We've had the burden of malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, vector-borne diseases like dengue and malaria for a very long time, for which government has put together many national programs. The deaths from diarrhea continue to be very high, and also from pneumonia, we lose almost 800,000 babies annually to pneumococcal infections. Now, coming to the next burden of infections is the hospital-acquired infections, which is recently being noticed that we have a large burden of hospital-acquired infections, and also we have a very close animal human interface, which leads to a lot of zoonotic infections like leptospirosis. So in order to address this large burden of infectious diseases, there have been vaccines, but the focus on hygiene, sanitation practices, the infection control practices, and diagnostics has actually been lagging, which leads to the infectious diseases being mishandled. There are many socioeconomic factors which actually contribute to overuse of antimicrobials. The first and foremost being that the doctor to patient ratio in our country is lower than what is prescribed by WHO. Secondly, there is a limited lab capacity and very few infectious disease physicians who are trained to treat infectious diseases, which leads to poor antimicrobial stewardship, thus contributing to increased broad spectrum use. And further, there is a socioeconomic factors like self-medication and non-compliance, and all these factors lead to overuse of antimicrobials in the community as well as in the hospitals. Now, we all know that the evolution of antimicrobial resistance is a direct consequence of selective pressure, which is applied by the overuse of antimicrobials. Now, India is a third largest producer of antimicrobials. We have almost a 12.4 billion pharmaceutical industry. We also don't have very tight regulations around the use of antibiotics, although recently government introduced an H1 schedule. However, the drugs are still available without prescription. There is a problem of counterfeit drugs, and then there are inappropriate fixed dose combinations of antimicrobials, which continue to feed the growing antimicrobial resistance. There is also large amount of antimicrobials which are used in livestock, poultry, and agriculture. However, the contribution of these factors of the use in poultry into the clinical aspects of AMR are still not known very well. Now, if we look at the trends of antibiotic consumption in India from 2000 to 2015, we see that the use of penicillin has more or less remained the same. Quinolones, which were very high in around 2005, has now declined the usage. However, the cephalosporins, which are again a broad spectrum antimicrobials of third generation, the use has consistently gone up. Besides the preferences by by the prescribers, there are also certain market forces which encourages the use of broad spectrum antibiotics. For example, we have only one producer of penicillin G in the country, but we have almost 135 companies which are making ceftexime. So this leads to the widespread availability of broad spectrum antimicrobials, including the carbapenems, and we have almost seen 150% increase in carbapenem usage between 2010 and 2014. Now, we are also seeing the repercussions of this in the fact that the MDR TB, the programs like malaria, gonorrhea, the neonatal sepsis, they are all suffering because of the overuse of certain drugs which are important to use treat these diseases. Now, this is compromising the gains that we made in the control of infectious diseases through the national programs. Also, we are seeing that the sterile procedures like ventilator-associated pneumonias, the knee and the hip replacements, something like a transplant or cesarean sections, are being compromised because of the hospital-acquired infections, which are usually multi-drug resistant. As we can see, the prevalence of MRSA in any hospital is between 20 to 40%. The ESBL's prevalence is between 30 to 60% and sometimes almost 80% in ICUs. The hospital-acquired infection incident rate in India is between 11 to 83%. This leads to high morbidity and mortality in the patients who are admitted to hospitals, and the drug-resistant infections continue to claim invisible victims, and even these numbers are not recorded sometimes in the healthcare system. So what initiatives has the Government of India taken to curb antimicrobial resistance problem in the country? We launched the National Action Plan in 2017, and it has the 6 pillars, which includes improving awareness and understanding, knowledge and evidence, infection prevention control, and optimal use of antimicrobials, strengthening the innovation and research and development by also strengthening the funding around R&D. And also we have a 6th pillar which is not there in the WHO guidance on global action plan, which is the pillar on the leadership, that there should be a national as well as the state level leadership, considering that the country like India is very diverse and very large to be managed by one single leadership. Then there has been some changes at the regulatory level. Government has introduced an H1 schedule, and under this schedule, almost 46 drugs were included in the schedule, so that they will not be available without the prescription from a doctor. This includes 24 antimicrobials belonging to the 3rd and the 4th generation cephalosporins and carbapenems, 11 anti-TB drugs. We were able to ban 354 fixed dose combinations, which also included antimicrobials, which were improper combinations. Then the colistin use in veterinary was very common, which was being used as a growth promoter. In 2019, government has banned the use of colistin as a growth promoter in the animal sector. So these are some of the promising steps that Government of India has taken. The others are to control the antimicrobial usage in the industry, which is in the livestock or in the poultry. We have set the tolerance limits for seafood, including the shrimps, prawns, and other variety of fish. This has been done by Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. However, we are still awaiting the limits for the poultry and the meat. Subsequently, Central Pollution Control Board is also looking at the antimicrobial residues which are there in the effluents, and they will be soon coming up with the standards for the industry. Now, the ICMR's antimicrobial resistance initiative started in 2013. It is a multi-pronged initiative. We have a AMR surveillance network, which looks at the trends and the patterns of drug resistance in the country. It looks at the clonality, the outbreaks, as well as the transmission dynamics. We also have put in place an external quality assurance system. Then there is an infection prevention control program, which looks at the hospital-acquired infections and build capacity for infection prevention and control in the hospitals. We also launched the antimicrobial stewardship program in 2018. The overarching aim is to establish the structure and process of AMSP in the hospitals and help them implement AMSP using their own hospital data, and also to monitor the clinical outcomes in the patients who are on antimicrobials. So we are looking at 6 pathogenic groups: Enterobacteriaceae, gram-negative non-fermenters, enteric fever, diarrheagenic organisms, MRSA and Enterococcus among gram-positives, and also fungal pathogens. This network is spread over 30 hospitals across the country, and there is one standard operating procedure which is being followed across all the hospitals. So standardization is one of the imperatives of this network. And if we look at the percentage of distribution of the species across the hospitals, this is the 2019 data, which is at the bottom of the slide. We can see that majority of the infections are caused by E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Staph aureus, and Acinetobacter baumannii. Although there is increasing incidence of Enterococcus faecalis and Faecium in the hospitals. So if we look at the data from last few years, we can say that antibiotic pressure is one of the major drivers of drug resistance in the country. In the Salmonella typhi, we see that there is 100% sensitivity to drugs like ampicillin, chloramphenicol, and cotramoxazole, because these drugs are not being used for treatment of Salmonella typhi in last few years. However, there is almost 80 to 90% resistance to fluoroquinolones, including ciprofloxacin, because this was one of the mainstay of typhoid treatment in last few years. The graph on the right side, it shows the increasing MIC to ceftriaxone, which is the current line of treatment for typhoid. We also see decreasing susceptibility to carbapenems almost by 5 to 10% every year. There is increasing MIC to tigecycline, linezolid, and colistin because their usage has gone up. Among the gram-positives, the glycopeptide resistance has increased in enterococci from 15% to almost 30% in last 2 years. Vancomycin resistance is 3 times higher in Enterococcus faecium when we compare to Enterococcus faecalis. And we are also seeing increasing phosphomycin resistance in almost 11.5% of the Enterococcus isolates. Now, what is also interesting is that we are also monitoring the resistance to antifungals, especially azoles, which are most commonly used. And you can see in this that in Candida albicans, the fluconazole susceptibility is almost 97%. Voriconazole susceptibility has reduced to 95%, and it is a kinocandins where the susceptibility is almost down by 2% from last year, and this year's susceptibility we saw is at 94%. Now, this is the data from Candida albicans, and most of you would know that we have been rattled by some of the Candida auris outbreaks across the globe, and these susceptibility levels are almost 10 to 20% lower in the Candida auris isolates, which we have seen from India. Now, this is the susceptibility trend for E. coli. As you can see, for amikacin, nothing much has changed. But at the same time, we have seen declining resistance to imipenem, but the meropenem more or less remains the same. While the susceptibility in E. coli is something between 80 to 90%, for most of the higher generation drugs, you can see the Klebsiella pneumoniae on the right side only has a susceptibility window of from 30 to 60%. So this is very alarming, and the prognosis for patients who get Klebsiella pneumoniae hospital-acquired infections is also very poor in our hospitals. Now, if we look at Acinetobacter baumannii and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the susceptibility to all the drugs in Acinetobacter baumannii is very low, as you can see. So the drugs of choice in this case remains colistin. Similarly, for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the drug susceptibility is higher and is more promising than Acinetobacter baumannii. Now, if we look at the drug resistance mechanisms and the mobile genetic elements that we observe in India, so it is primarily OXA48, it is NDM and very few KPC, and further variations of OXA48 is what we see. Added to that are efflux pumps and other mutations. So this whole situation looks quite alarming, because if this is the basis on which a physician has to decide empirical therapy, it is rather challenging not to prescribe broad spectrum drugs. Also, this particular table presents some of the drugs which are in the pipeline, which have been recently being launched or about to be launched in the global markets. And as we can see that all these drugs may not be effective against the genotypes which are currently circulating in India, especially NDMs. And we have a large proportion of infections which are caused by NDM genes. So we need new drugs, we need new treatment options to treat the patients who have the NDMs and OXA48. Now, what do we do with this data? This data we are using to devise treatment guidelines. We are using to, Astrid, I want to go back 2 slides. Can you please help? So this data we are using to devise antimicrobial stewardship program and to guide the infection prevention and control program in the country. We have trained the physicians, the infection control nurses and pharmacists in more than 60 medical colleges and hospitals across the country, with an overarching aim to establish the structure and process of antimicrobial stewardship. We are also helping all these hospitals to come up with the antimicrobial stewardship guidelines. The overall sentiment behind this initiative is that unless we actively work to rationalize the antibiotic prescriptions and use judiciously what we have, having new drugs is not going to be an answer, because we will soon lose the new drugs also if we don't use them rationally and responsibly. ICMR entered into a memorandum of understanding with GARD-P. We, as a country, do have a strong need for new treatments for drug-resistant pathogens like gonorrhea, neonatal sepsis, typhoid, Klebsiella, and Candida auris. And GARD-P is working towards development of new treatment and drug options. And ICMR will be working very closely with the GARD-P and look at the potential for establishing clinical trial sites for the drugs which are in the pipeline in India. ICMR network has been instrumental in establishing the need for the new drugs, providing the information on the clinically relevant mechanisms of resistance, the source of organisms for drug discovery, and early spectrum of activity can be obtained from this particular network. And this network can also help in selecting the doses and recommending the in vitro susceptibility testing criteria. Since we are spread out all over the country, we are also in a position to select the most appropriate geographic regions from the data which is available so far for the clinical trials. So for any clinical trial, the requirement is that we should have a sponsor which can look at the funding, the site selection and monitoring, this overarching study design, the training, the DSMB requirements, or the data management issues. But most important is the clinical trial site, where we should have the required population, adequate laboratory support, a site which is capable of monitoring the severe adverse events. There should be an ethics committee. There should also be a capability to do the PK/PD studies alongside the clinical trial, and compliance to the guidelines, frameworks, and manage the data entry and other activities related to the clinical trial. ICMR surveillance network, in fact, is well poised to answer to this particular requirement. We have a real-time distribution of species and susceptibility phenotypes. There is a coverage of wide geographic area. We are using susceptibility tests which are in alignment with the known international standards. There is a centralized testing and quality assurance processes in place. We also undertake the molecular characterization of important organisms. There is a central repository for these organisms, and most of our hospitals, they have a committee which oversees the ethics and the other research related aspects. Every hospital has a team of microbiologists, research scientists, and the necessary lab technicians, as well as a clinical team which includes an ID physician or an intensivist and pharmacist and nurses as well. So once we have the sites in place, it is very important that we have a regulatory environment which is conducive for the approvals of the new drug products. And over here, we are talking about antimicrobial products. Now, the regulatory mechanism in India is governed by the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And the prerequisite for conducting any trial in India are that it should have a permission from DCGI, approval from the local ethics committee of the hospital, and a mandatory registration with the Clinical Trial Registry of India, which is maintained by ICMR at its website. So the drugs and clinical trial rules were recently modified, and revised rules were released in 2019, which were notified by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And the idea was to transform the regulatory landscape for approval of new drugs. It was applicable to all new drugs, ethics committee, the investigational drugs for human use, the bioequivalence studies, and all the clinical trials. So many changes were made in these clinical trial rules. The first one, which is most important, is that the time for approving applications is reduced to 30 days for the drugs manufactured in India, and 90 days for those developed outside the country. The DCGI and the ethics committee will monitor the trial very closely for the compensation or for the adverse events. The new drugs approved for use in select markets can be automatically allowed if there were no serious adverse events. And the new regulations also remove the regulations on tests conducted in animals in case of drugs which are already approved in the overseas drug markets. Now, this is the overall design, how the flow chart looks like. There is a provision for application of accelerated approval with the condition of requirement of post-marketing trial. The clinical data requirement may be relaxed or omitted under certain conditions. And my friend Anand will talk about some of this in detail in his presentation. There is an evaluation by IND or a scientific committee. And for the antimicrobial group, the microbiologists, pharmacologists, and the treating physicians have been specifically included to review the applications related to new antimicrobial products. And as I mentioned previously, every application will get a permission, rejection, or a query within 90 working days. Now, there is a specific provision for a waiver of local clinical trial for a new drug, and there can be different conditions under which it can be waived. The first and the foremost being if the global clinical trial is being done where India is already participating, and there is no adverse events reported in other countries, or there are no factors in the local population which affect the PK/PD safety or the efficacy of the new drug. This has also been put to practice. It's not just that it exists on the paper. DCGI approved 2 drugs, Delaminate and Bedaquiline, for use of TB without undertaking the clinical trials in India because the TB patients and the XDR TB patients needed new drugs. So this is something which has already been done. So the way forward is that we have a very conducive regulatory system now in place, which is very supportive of clinical research through a very transparent and a fast yielding approvals. And ICMR has a network of hospitals which are located in tertiary care hospitals, which are supported by the state of art microbiology labs and have abundant clinical samples and availability of clinicians and ID physicians who can provide leadership. So this creates a very conducive environment to test new drugs, new diagnostics, undertake PK/PD studies for antibiotics for which it has not been done before, and also test some of the antimicrobial stewardship related interventions. And all these initiatives will help us come with new treatment options for the patients having the drug resistant infections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamini, for the very nice talk. And all the important data you presented about the regulatory landscape and the infections surveillance in India. And now we are gonna introduce our next speaker, which is Anandkumar. Anand is the co-founder and CEO of Bugworks, which is an Indo-USA biotech tackling the problem of antimicrobial resistance, especially these superbugs implicated in hospital infections that are multi-drug resistance. And at the same time, also some pathogens involved in the bioterrorism situations. The company is trying to design a new next generation antibiotics that can tackle a broad spectrum of superbugs, and they expect to enter into first-in-human clinical trials by the end of this year. And also lately they have branched out into investigating broad-spectrum antivirals, which is a critical priority now with the COVID epidemic. Before being the CEO and co-founder of Bugworks, Anand was co-founder and managing director of Cellworks, a company which was one of the pioneers in personalized cancer therapy area, using some kind of mathematical modeling frameworks to simulate cancer pathways. Anand is also very involved in the whole biotech AMR sector. He is a member of the executive committee of the Indian Biotech Association. He's also a board member of the AMR Industry Alliance. He's also an advisor for CCAMP, which is Carbeck's India Incubator, and he is also a member of the Indian Advisory Group of GARP, and we are very happy to have regular contacts with him. Anand is also a co-founder of EVA and Impress, which are biotech incubators that are supporting startups in the Indian biotech ecosystem, as well as an active angel investor in the local biotech ecosystem in India, with an emphasis in supporting AMR innovations. Just to complete the whole picture, Anand is also a very avid philanthropist. He's a founding trustee of Child, an NGO in India that takes care of young children orphaned by HIV/AIDS, and also a co-founder of Humanist India, a foundation that supports cancer treatment for those that are below the poverty line. So, Anand, please go ahead, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Francois. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Astrid and all of you at GARP for this great opportunity. And it's good to meet all of you. I will be talking about India as a case study. I think Dr. Kamini has set up a very nice platform. And then I will look at it from an innovator's perspective. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities in India? I think all of us know that India is a complex place. It's got a lot of challenges. So my emphasis and accentuation will be more on the opportunities. Okay, I am actually, guys, India is a complex country and it's a perfect study in contrast. You can walk around in a small neighborhood and you can see fancy homes like anywhere in the world. And then you can see, an area, a slum that has several 100,000 people in a few square kilometers. It's really a fascinating country, but it also, the contrast is in your face. And if you look at the hospital infrastructure, it can go from, really difficult environments to outstanding environments that people from the rest of the world come to India for medical tourism. So it's complex to see how all of this can exist in the same frame. and you walk to a typical primary healthcare center, it can look something like this. So we have our challenges with the situation. But at the same time, look at this fascinating picture of India, right? 1.35 billion people, $3.2 trillion in GDP. It's in 2020. At the same time, you have several 100 million people who are below poverty line. Poverty as defined as below $2 per day. The health spend is only 1.3% of our GDP, and we have about 0.5 beds for 1,000 people. Yet, we are a rising star when you look at information technology, biotechnology, satellite communication, etc. It's the epicenter for antimicrobial resistance, as was so beautifully explained by Kamini. But it's also the vaccine capital of the world. As you all know, with COVID-19, there is a big dependency on India for generic manufacturing of antibiotics, to paracetamol, to hydroxychloroquine when it was still in vogue. And when we get the vaccine that we are all hoping for, India will be playing a very important role with the manufacturing. So we are a solution provider, and I would like to use this opportunity to talk about how India is not just a land of issues, but a land of opportunities. And it's great to be able to do innovation close to the epicenter. When you're able to do innovation right next to where the problem is, you have what is called contextual innovation. It's highly affordable. So it's affordability, contextualization, can we make a difference to the world? So if I look at the challenges, and some of it was covered by Dr. Kamini, right? It's rising MDR cases. We are quickly losing frontline antibiotics. Poor sanitation and access to clean water, which is one of the fundamental reasons that promotes antimicrobial resistance. We are making progress in all these areas, but these are some crucial, important reasons. Poor stewardship, as you also heard, there's easy availability of antibiotics, and there's use in poultry, in agro. And as you know, India generic manufacturers produce a large percentage of the antibiotics from all over the world. And that manufacturing waste for some of those companies ends up in the water stream, in our soil, in our food chains, causing lots of challenges for us. And the innovation to do AMR work, whether it's diagnostics, devices, therapy, it's super challenge. This is my 5th startup, and I have never been more challenged, and I'm enjoying it. But because the tendency to fund in India is typically driven by technology, tech companies, mobile commerce, e-commerce, and there's a preference over deep science. Thanks to the Indian government, through the grants that we get from Department of Biotechnology and support from people like Carbex, Wellcome Trust, GARDP, we've been able to get through the early funding issues. And regulatory challenges galore. It's a huge opportunity, but we do have a problem with regulation. We are not known for our regulation, but major changes, and there's some good tailwind in this space. And of course, to introduce a new product to India is very challenging because it's highly price sensitive. And when we say India is a huge consumer of antibiotics, it's obviously the generics. So now let's look at the glass half full, which is how I like to play it, right? AMR National Action Plan, multiple initiatives from the government, stringent manufacturing guidelines, ban of colistin use in poultry, etc. Great initiatives. Of course, to be able to implement those initiatives will be challenging, but hey, we have a good start now. Highly conducive ecosystem for innovation. Like I said, the ability to work with hospitals in India to gain access to MDR, XDR pathogens early in the drug discovery process, to the AMR clusters that are coming up, the MDR repositories, and the cost of doing innovation is phenomenal. It's hard to beat. By the way, when you say it's low cost, it's not cheap innovation. It's affordable innovation that has to be world class. And fast changing regulatory environment, and I'll talk about it in subsequent slides, as did Dr. Kamini, with accelerated pathways. And there's an opportunity for global data harmonization. That means India's clinical trials will be at par with everywhere in the world. You're able to do trials in India and then transport that data in other dossiers all over the world. And world-class CMC, which is chemistry manufacturing control. India is the CMC capital of the world. Why should we have to invest in new CMC when we can partner with world-class FDA-approved, EMA-approved CMC vendors? And it's a real market opportunity for innovative products. I honestly believe that there is a $50 to $100 million per year that one can make with an innovative antibiotic if it's truly broad spectrum. India can and will don the regional leadership mantle. We are the powerhouse in the region, and now we have to step up in terms of the AMR leadership as well. We already see some changes towards that, which is quite positive. This is a slide that should be known to most of you who are watching in here. We have 102 low to medium LMICs, if you will, and AMR is a problem here and everywhere in the world. And by 2050, if we don't tackle this, we're going to lose 100 trillion in economy, which is 3.5% of global GDP, and we're going to be losing about 10 million lives. And if you look at India, it's unfortunately one of the most vulnerable regions. So if you look at Lord O'Neill's numbers of 10 million, roughly 50% of that 10 million comes from Asia, as you can see here, right? 4.7 to 5, 50%. And I would like to think that almost 40 to 50% of the numbers would come from India alone. So it's a huge challenge. We have to solve the problem. We have to find solutions locally for the problems here, which will then hopefully allow for global solutions. And very quickly, India has taken tremendous steps from 2010 to 2020. The last 10 years has been a turnaround in AMR, because we realize that antimicrobial resistance can singularly destroy India's aspirations to have SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. All this great infrastructure, all this great IT and telecommunication and biotechnology that we're doing could be destroyed if our hospital infections and community infections continue the way that they are, right? And with this 10-year work, including the latest national action plan, we are starting to see an improved awareness of AMR, prevention and control focus, optimization of antibiotics between animal health and food, increased investment in R&D, and India trying to take on a leadership position for AMR. Long way to go, but we're making strides. And if you look at Department of Biotechnology, DBT, it's a nodal body in this country that's promoting lots of innovation around AMR. Where I sit is in research and innovation for therapeutics, and they often have calls like Carbex, like GARDP, of course, much lower amount of funding, but important seed funding and important infrastructure that they give for new antibiotics and alternative antibiotics. And there's this important repository that's set up in Pune, which I hope will be of huge value, not just for innovators from India, but from everywhere. This is going to be a large repository of bacteria and fungi, and I understand it's also going to be virals. We work very closely with the WHO to define and refine and redefine what the AMR specific pathogens of national priority are. Dr. Kamini already spelled them out. It's very obvious to us that Klebsiella, E. coli, and the non-fermenters, particularly Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter, are huge problems. And there is a huge amount of innovation in India that's going on in the diagnosis space, much more in diagnosis and devices than in therapy. And that's understandable for the type of talent pool we have here and for the type of investment dynamics. It's very understandable that more work happens in in diagnostics and devices as compared to therapy. And India has joined the global AMR R&D hub in 2019, which is a very welcome move. Sobering stats, I won't go through this much in detail because it was covered so well by Dr. Kamini. Klebsiella takes 1/3 of the cake. And then if I look at Acinetobacter plus Pseudomonas, that's another 1/3. So we have some huge issues. We need solutions, right? And we can't wait for the West to come and fix our problems. We need to fix our own problems and be part of a global village that is solving this problem. And then if you look at a study that came in 2017, on collagen resistance, it's eye-popping numbers that Klebsiella had about 37% resistance and E. coli 8% resistance. It's 3 years old data, and the sample size was not very big, but it's very troubling that your very last line resort drug is developing resistance thus. And I will not cover this because Dr. Kamini has already covered to say that we are losing most of these antibiotics. We need new therapies. So the problem in India is access and excess. Owing to excess of generics, whatever little antibiotics you have, you lose. And you don't have access because there's very little innovation globally and in India going on. So you hit at access and excess. And most of the doctors I speak to say that we lose people not because of excess, but because of lack of access. So it's a very complex dynamics between access and excess. AMR innovations from India. If I look at the latest data that came from the WHO, there are just 5 companies in India, including yours truly, Bugworks, that are working on therapy, right? So very few, heavily dominated by the United States, which is understandable. So only a handful work on therapies, tens of companies working on preventing infection spread, and I'll talk about 1 or 2 companies as exemplars, hundreds of companies working on the diagnostic space to make cheap diagnostics, spot diagnostics, point of care, easy to use, reusable, less than 30 minutes, right? So really interesting. Very happy that Carbex and GARDP are looking at India as an innovation possibility because they realize we can solve problems affordably and in context. where the problem is heavy. Carbex has funded 2 companies, and we hope to hear more from them. And I'm so happy, we should all be happy that GARD-P finds India to be a focus area. Particularly things like neonatal sepsis and pediatric issues are huge in India. And when I saw Dr. Kamini's numbers, 800,000 just in pneumonia, wow, it makes my job truly worth it. Every morning I wake up, it's when I see numbers like that and say we have to do something about it, and we need to fix this problem now. So sorry. CCamp, where I sit, is it's called Center for Cellular and Molecular Platforms. It's the AMR Innovation Hub in India, in Bangalore, and I'm proud to be part of it. And this is a picture from Carbex webpage that says that CCamp is the only accelerator incubator in a large part of the world that holds most of the people, interestingly. And we are very proud to have brought CCamp and Carbex together as Bugworks. Number of companies in here from CCamp doing interesting work in AMR, and it's good to see these hubs. We did not have this 5 years ago, so that's the change that we see. And I'm going to go through a few exemplars. Allow me to spend a couple of slides speaking about Bugworks. I'm extremely fortunate to work with some talented folks, most of them ex-AstraZeneca, that we put together this company with Bugworks. The company has about 250 years of AMR experience. We use a combination of classical pharmaceutical sciences and modeling and simulation for structural biology, computational chemistry, medicinal chemistry to try to crack the superbug. We are only 25 people inside the company. We have a dream team of a scientific advisory board, a global board, and we work with the world. And our AMR solutions are broad spectrum, novel class of compounds, novel chemotypes, both IV and oral step down for serious hospital infections and community infections. And more recently, we are also looking at biodefense. I'm sure all of you are hearing about the potential of a bubonic plague re-emerging. I hope that's not true, but we're hearing about that. So we need to be prepared for both escape type of pathogens and the type of class A, class B pathogens that cause, anthracis, bubonic plague, etc., etc. And that's the broad spectral combination that we have. And we want to make our products at the end quite affordable and accessible. That's why we did this company. It's a global problem. We would like to be part of the global solution, but it needs to be affordable and accessible. Otherwise, we would have lost the plot. Just to go through, to let you know that sitting from India, this is Bugworks. Bugworks is a small little company in the middle, and then it takes the whole globe to produce solutions for AMR. And that's the beauty of the power of the globe. When we come together and we can synergize the best from different parts of the world, magic happens. And that's the magic that we're trying to create from Bugworks. It takes a globe, and I'm deeply thankful to our funders who are shown here, including Carbex and Japanese funders, UTech and Global Brain, as well as the Indian government, BIRAC. So we're very happy to have all these partners. And it's interesting that if we didn't have these partners, post-COVID time, we would have found it very difficult to make progress. It's now that we have different countries coming and working with us that we can actually mix and match our partners depending on which country has come out of COVID or is handling COVID slightly better than the others. This is our pipeline. Very quickly, multiple products going through the pipeline. They're all broad spectrum. We want to focus on respiratory diseases with pneumonia, etc. And we have one asset that's focused on cystic fibrosis that's going to preclinical. Our lead asset is a hospital infection, serious hospital infection asset that we hope will enter clinical trials later this year, funded by Carbex. Major thanks to them. I will just skip all the bugs that we handle because I would like to move on. To talk about another company out of the same Bangalore cluster, GangaGen, also run by ex-AstraZeneca folks. AstraZeneca has made a huge impact in India and has a phenomenal talent pool of anti-infective professionals. And they're a protein antibiotic company that's working on designing novel protein antibiotics. Their focus was staph. It continues to be staph, but they've also added gram-negative. So I've just given you 2 exemplars of companies doing therapeutical work here, doing cutting-edge work right from here. Just going to spend 2-3 minutes talking about a few other type of companies that come out of our cluster. Here's an interesting company, Koyo Labs, going through trials where they figured out a fantastic methodology to prevent the pooling of liquid, avoiding the pooling of secretions in the lungs, which is one of the fundamental reasons for ventilator-acquired pneumonia, VAP, right? Because of the pooling of secretions is a very conducive environment to breed staph, Pseudomonas, etc. Fascinating company, and all of the innovation done from here very, very affordably. In fact, it's called affordable innovation in medtech. Just an example. Here's another company, Biomonitor, also based out of the Bangalore ecosystem, out of CCAMP, that's designed a box that's able to suck out a particular volume of air in a hospital or a clean room or an airplane, for example, and be able to take out bacteria, fungi, and virus using some very, very interesting biophysics and electrostatics concepts, no UV. And this, they're just going to production right now. Won't go into much of the details, just to let you know that it's disruptive technology, and a technology like this to prevent the spread of COVID-19 or prevent the spread of bacterial infections can be used in healthcare environment, in clean rooms, in air conditioning, in automotives, airplanes. And the last example that I have is a company funded by Carbex on the diagnostic side. They call Module Innovation, and they've come out with a very, very cool spot-based UTI diagnostics, right? They do it, I think, in 15 to 20 minutes. And it's fantastic. It's extremely affordable. It's point of care. You don't need trained personnel. So we have to start thinking of a large country where 1.35 billion people are not just in rural areas, not in metropolitan cities. They spread everywhere. So you're constantly thinking about how to make your products easy for rurality, right? That local intelligence of how to make products that are affordable and contextual. That's why it's so exciting, and it's nice to see Carbex funding. Clinical trials out of India, right? Clinical trials came out of India fundamentally driven by generics. So the mindset of regulation, the mindset of the industry was coming from a generic perspective. And now we are slowly moving that to an innovation. Not easy, because that's a DNA change. So those are the struggles we are having right now. There is an availability of large number of drug resistance patients. When I know that some of the small to medium enterprises like Bugworks in the US and other countries are spending 3 to 4 years recruiting multi-drug resistant Acinetobacter patients, I often tell them, come to India. You have plenty of drug resistance patients, and this is a country you need to be including early in your process, not later in your process. Many CROs have their operations in India, including IQVIA, Medpace. Potentially faster recruitment rates. I use the word potentially very carefully, because if you want to get patients who are completely treatment naive with clean antibiotic background, may not be easy. And there's a widespread adoption now of ICH GCP guidelines, and it's a fraction of the cost of West. It is wonderful that the Indian regulators are talking to FDA, EMA, PMDA, and I must thank ICMR and GuardP for creating the platform that allows for this conversation. Just to let you know, India has 16% of worldwide population, 20% of global disease burden, yet only 1.4% of the global trials are done here. Clearly an area for improvement, growth, therefore opportunity. Just to quickly touch on a point, this is very, very important for people who are looking at India. This is the major change, that India has waived clinical trial requirements for drugs approved in the US, UK, EU bloc, Japan, and Australia. They do have certain requirements that you would do a phase 4, but that's okay. You can go to market here with potentially based on approvals from outside. They've relaxed the condition even for phase 4 based on few other things, including TB, AMR, Hep C, etc. So this is wonderful to see. So please consider India as a launch area when you're looking at the globe. Access to patients, creation of new markets, and much better regulatory pathways. For those of us who are designing products for the world out of India, the new accelerated approvals in India is fascinating. This is from the CDS CEO, which is our FDA equivalent. And it says that for serious life-threatening conditions, unmet medical needs, you can actually go to market, limited approval to market based on a phase 2. Of course, the devil is always in the details. And it says that you need to take surrogate endpoints can be considered, and approvals will be given if remarkable efficacy will be observed in phase 2. We need to work with the regulator to define and quantify what that means. But think about it. We are actually thinking about if we get a successful phase 1 and we can do a phase 2 in India, in a tough area like HAP-WAP, that's a possibility exists today, which didn't exist thus far, that we can take it to market for that indication based on phase 2. And then you have to come back and complete a phase 4, etc. And once you gain approvals in India, India is connected to the ASEAN region, to African countries, to Central America. You can then gain access to other markets. So one has to start thinking not just Western world for a market, but look at this, as I said, the globe is thy stage. One of the most important slides that I want to share with all of you is this. A very large percentage of the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls happens from India. If I look at the top 20 generic companies in the world, everything that is circled here are Indian companies. And then if you go to the top 40, 50 list, it's heavily dominated by Indian companies. High quality, low cost, and they're able to scale. So I would definitely want this body of folks, these companies, to work closely with AMR companies so that we don't have to invest $100-200 million in rebuilding CMC. It doesn't make sense. AMR Dynamics does not allow for it. It allows for good partnerships. Get the best out of each region. The region here is fantastic for CMC, and one needs to look at partnering with them. I just have a couple more slides. And if you look at the generic medicine manufacturers who are manufacturing the essential medicine list in WHO, large percentage of them will be from India, and they are manufacturing most of the antibiotics that we use, you use, I use, and the world is using at large, even post-COVID-19. So India is an anti-infective generics factory to the world, deep competencies in CMC and how to market, sell, and distribute in low, medium income countries. That's local intelligence that you just don't take for granted. And AMR space does not allow for CMC. We need to have partnerships, and small companies like ours have to rely on these partnerships to go to market. Coming to my last two slides, we just did an analysis talking to companies here. Can we ever create a $50 to $100 million antibiotic market here? We just looked at meropenem, vancomycin, about 75 manufacturers of mero, 26 manufacturers of vancomycin. Indian antibiotics market is about 2.5 billion. Meropenem is approximately 8% of this market, 200 million. And vancomycin is about 100 million, right? Not very big numbers because these are generics based, but huge volume. Steadily rising, drug resistance rates to carbapenems, vancomycin, linezolid, etc. And then we said we went and spoke to a number of hospitals, to clinicians, to companies, right? So this is not yet published. What would a new broad spectrum that can tackle MDR, XDR, gram-positive and gram-negatives, particularly in the hospital environment, be able to do for you? And the thought process is in about 3 to 5 years, you can start taking a small percentage replacement market of carbapenems and vancomycin, right? 10% of meropenem. And even if you price your new drug at just 2 times what you pay for meropenem, which is generics, that's about 50 million per year. If you take 10% of vancomycin and you price your new drug at only 2 times what you pay for generics, you're at 25 million. And then I'll be nice to myself and add another 5% of imipenem and linezolid. That's 25 million. It's not crazy to fathom $100 million, 50, 25, 25, $100 million market in about 5 years of launching a new product in India. Those numbers may not be attractive to big pharma, but they're very attractive to SMEs who are otherwise struggling in this space. I'm just going to go, but we have to make the products highly subsidized for public health distribution. So there is a biphasic costing strategy. One is public health, make it totally affordable and sort of ubiquitous with certain stewardship. And then there is this large upper middle class to middle class in India that can afford $300 for a 5-day treatment of meropenem. So you have to look at both these things. Otherwise, this pricing will not work for everyone. What can India do to promote AMR R&D? My last slide. Right. India is the powerhouse of the region, economically and in many other ways, right? Politically, etc. And lots of people look at India right now for global supply chains post-COVID. It needs to step up leadership in AMR. We're doing a lot, but a lot more needs to be done in terms of funding and making it a top priority. Clinical trial networks of best global standards, Dr. Kamini spoke about that. Accelerated pathways and data harmonization for drug-resistant infection products. This will make India a really attractive place for people to come and do trials and use data from here and real-world evidence to embellish dossiers elsewhere. Fastest, safest, cheapest pathway to get drugs done globally if we can include a region like India very early in your planning. Share lessons learned from huge disease burden, surveillance, and stewardship. We have to share these lessons. And India needs to spearhead. I would like to suggest, and the people from the government listening here, an AMR infrastructure fund, right? Along with the Asian Development Bank and along with companies in this region including Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, etc. Easy, doesn't cost much. It just takes some political will and realize that we have a huge volcano that's going to erupt on us, right? As I often say, COVID is a volcano that has erupted unbelievably. AMR is a volcano that we can see, We think it's a smoking gun because it's just smoking away, but it's not a smoking gun. And when it erupts, it'll have far more disastrous effects. And we see what has happened with COVID, how woefully unprepared we are as a world and as a region here. So much more can be done to create an infrastructure fund. And we have successfully created marketplaces for TB and malaria. Different diseases, different dynamics. But can we take lessons from TB and malaria and use it for AMR? Right? It's very, very important. Pooled purchases, so that you're guaranteed certain volume by the government, and you don't have to then, really worry about marketing and selling your product. You're guaranteed volume and pricing when you work with a pooled purchase model. My last point is, I hope India will step up and also support pull incentives. Many of you may know that later today, we're expecting a major announcement in the world of antibiotics in terms of how there's going to be support for clinical development and possibly pull incentives. I do hope to see India feature prominently in the future in supporting pull incentives for this space, because it's very hard to move forward if the economics aspect of the back end is not fixed. I want to thank you and GuardP for this fantastic opportunity, and stay safe and healthy. Looking forward to your questions, and hopefully the next time we speak, it'll be live post-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand, for an excellent presentation. And we will now start our question and answer session. As a quick reminder for the audience, you can submit your questions as shown on the slide that is right now on the screen. And we will do our best to respond as many questions as possible during the allocated times. Also, normally, if there are questions that we don't manage to answer during this session, once the webinar is put, the recording of the webinar is put on the web, normally we try to answer those questions at that time. So let's start with a couple of questions that we already had. Here is one for you, Anand. Let me just give me a second to make it a bit bigger. Okay. In your opinion, what does governments and other organizations need to do to incentivize the discovery of new antibiotics? What do you think is the critical missing incentive to really guarantee that people does antibiotic research and development?
You talk. Sorry, I missed the first half of your question. Are you talking from a European context or purely from an India context?
I'm talking from a global perspective, but also
Right.
in India, yes.
See, Francois, you probably know well, and to our listener, the major problem with antibiotics used to be scientific innovation, and that has been cracked beautifully with the support of GuardP, Carbex, Wellcome Trust, Indian government support, etc. Then there were regulatory hurdles, and there's a lot of work going on in making regulation better. We still have some ways to go. The biggest issue in ability to get new products through an AMR is the back end, that we don't have a marketplace. Because AMR, particularly if you look at antibiotics, to be very specific, it does not lend itself to volume sales. You can't treat it like a hypertension drug or a CNS drug, right? Because otherwise you will lose it. You use it, you lose it. And you only want to use it for the patients that matter. So we have a complex dynamics in that you spend almost $1 billion to get a drug out, but you can't use it. You want to keep it carefully for that difficult patient for whom it's life and death, which means the biggest problem in this discussion is the back-end economics. There is a lack of a business model that can support innovation. Diagnostics and devices struggle with the same problem, but therapies struggle with it even more. So hopefully with governments coming together, big 20 pharmaceutical companies coming together, with the initiatives that we see happening, hopefully that will be announced later today. I hope today will be a turning point. This is me wishful thinking. I hope it's a turning point. But if we don't fix the business end, we will continue to struggle to bring new innovation to the market.
Thank you, Anand. I have another question here. It is the attendant is asking if, and I guess that's probably more for Kamini, if the surveillance data that is collected in India, it also has some component to understand what type of resistance at the genetic level are you seeing on those pathogens that are resistant to the different antibiotics, Kamini?
Thanks, Francois. And Regarding the genotypic characterization of the strains, the drug-resistant strains that are circulating, so yes, this is an important part of the ICMR's AMR surveillance network. And we routinely carry out tests, the PCR, the whole genome sequencing to understand what are the mechanism of resistance, for example, in E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae. So all these bugs are routinely analyzed for the mechanism of resistance. We have recently initiated the genomic surveillance, which is the One Health kind of a genomic surveillance, which includes the hospital, the environment, as well as the animal sector for two bugs, which is E. coli as well as the Klebsiella pneumoniae, and we will further expand this to include few more bugs. So, and this data is also routinely published. The 2019 report is almost ready and should be online on ICMR website by next week.
Thank you, Kamini. And related to that same question, the same person was asking if, and I guess you mentioned something about that in your presentation, if there was an effort to have a collection of genomes or the genetic sequences of all these strains, and if they will be somehow available in the future.
Yes, there are two repositories which are there in India. Anand mentioned about the one by Department of Biotechnology, which actually collects strain from many institutions as well as the hospitals. And there's another one which is being established at National Institute of Cholera and Enteric Diseases in Kolkata, which will mainly house the drug-resistant strains, the well-characterized drug-resistant strains from the ICMR AMR surveillance network.
Great. I have another question here, and somebody was asking that in your presentation, Kamini, you mentioned that the susceptibility of E. coli and Klebsiella pneumoniae is decreasing every year for imipenem, and the attendant was asking if you could speculate as to why this is happening.
So there are many factors to it. The prime among them is the antimicrobial usage. You would also know that there are, till some time back, there was only injectable option for carbapenem, which is imipenem, ertapenem, meropenems, and few more. But then few years back, parapenem was introduced, which is an oral carbapenem. So many a times a patient is just discharged and he is put on a oral this product, although it is not a carbapenem, but it has cross reaction with the carbapenems. So we think, I mean, we don't have really data to kind of substantiate it, but yes, the sale of ferropenem in the Indian markets is very high. And we think to an extent, ferropenem is contributing to the increase in 5 to 10% resistance to penems that we see, not just in E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae as well, and also gram-negative non-fermenters.
Thank you, Kamini. There is here a general question. Somebody's asking if there is in India any kind of a specific guideline available by DGCI for the development of anti-infective drug candidates, in the sense of what type of MIC data you need, what type of strains, what type of surveillance you need, what type of efficacy models, if there is anything like that coming out from DCGI.
I am not aware of such a specific guidance. Anand, do you have any information on this?
Not a specific one, but when we met with the DCGI, Francois, in the last meeting, thankfully organized by ICMR and GARDP, they were very open and they said they're going to be potentially coming out with guidelines, because I specifically asked this question. And then, of course, COVID happened and the whole world has changed. But the answer is right now, today, we may not have it, but there is a willingness to define that. Because clearly, if they want to allow phase 2, and you to go to market with based on phase 2 data, I'm sure we will have the guidelines and information, and hopefully make it available to the world when it happens.
Thank you, Anand. So somebody is also asking about the use of very broad spectrum antibiotics and how that affects the microbiome, especially in, say, young children or people with other comorbidities. and asking how wise do you think that it will be then to use a very broad spectrum antibiotic? Can any of you comment on that?
So broad usage of broad spectrum antibiotics is a concern with us, and we now know from our experience that, for example, high use of imipenem can also increase the level of resistance to amikacin and other cephalosporins. That's the reason that the entire antimicrobial stewardship program is kind of focused on reducing the use of broad spectrum antimicrobials and encouraging the use of narrow spectrum antimicrobials. But for that, you need a good diagnostic. Only then the prescriber feels confident prescribing a narrow spectrum antimicrobial. But yes, we do understand that there is a cross resistance, and there is definitely effect of using one broad spectrum antimicrobial over the other higher generation antimicrobials.
Thank you, Kamini. Yeah, and I agree fully with you that diagnostics is a very important component of this whole thing. Somebody else here is asking if there is any, and Anand touched a little bit on that, but if any of you have any knowledge of any specific plans of the government of India with regards to support economic development of antibiotics, since especially we have seen that, say, the last couple of companies that brought antibiotics into the market went bankrupt after bringing them into the market.
If I may take that, right? There are some discussions going on, but they're very preliminary, Francois. Unfortunately, COVID definitely has put this on the back burner because we have other far more serious issues to take care of right now. But I do believe the Ministry of Health, intergovernmental ministries folks that we spoke to realize that we have to support innovation, and they realize that this is a big problem that we need to step up and we cannot wait for the West to solve this problem. And if there's no market here for a new product or no support from the government, why should anyone launch here? It's very obvious. Why should, and I'll be very brutally honest, why should anybody launch here except for humanitarian grounds? And thankfully, thanks for that. But I do hope that moving forward and things settle down with COVID and there's far more urgency and worry about AMR, that AMR could, we've seen how the world looks like in a pandemic. And so we don't need to imagine up how things could look if there is a MDR pandemic happening and none of the drugs work that we have. Francois, I don't have a definite answer except to say that the government is thinking about it. They're also looking at pooled purchases, like subscription type models, where you're guaranteed a certain volume and then through the public health, they will do distributions. Much easier said than done, but at least a narrative has started within the government circles to say, hey, if we don't put some incentive, subscription model and or market entry reward, why should anybody come here?
Thank you. Somebody else is asking here about genetic companies and asking to hear your opinion if those genetic companies may play a role in bringing, for example, branded antibiotics to the antibacterial market, especially in places like India. If you think that will be especially given the big footprint that the genetic companies have in India.
Can I take that, Dr. Kamini?
Yes.
Sure,
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
So as I said in one of my slides, right, everything from CMC, Francois, chemistry, manufacturing, control, marketing, sales, distribution in LMICs, these folks have it. They know how to do it. And when we look at some of the bankruptcies in AMR, such a large percentage of funding goes into CMC. We know how expensive CMC can be. And then the post-launch costing is also extremely complicated. Honestly, I don't think we have a choice. We have to learn to partner with companies in Africa, in India, and other parts of the world where they have local intelligence of manufacturing, distribution, and sales. There is no other model that I know of. Unless a pull incentive happens, Francois, and we have some certain amount of money on the table until that happens, I can't see any other move forward model except partnering with the generics folks here, which means you have to come out with a business model where it's a royalty based, or you split the revenue in some apportioning fashion. We have to think out of the box. I know as a small company, Bugworks succeeds and we're able to take a product to market. I cannot invest in CMC. I won't invest in CMC. because AMR doesn't allow for that kind of return on investment. So we have to be humbled by the realities of the dynamics of the finances in the space and get the right partnerships going in the right countries.
Thank you, Anand. One question here for, I think, Kamini. Kamini, do you envision any kind of digital health initiative to help in the fight against AMR, and if there is a role in digital health, for example, in improving clinical trials or antibiotic stewardship in India?
Well, I would say there is a lot of scope for digital health in AMR, antimicrobial stewardship, and especially infection prevention and control. But then it's a lot more training, intensive interventions. So to start with, we are still depending upon, the face-to-face interactions or meetings. But yes, over a period of time, to expand to the institutions the way we have, it's spread out all over the country. I think we will have to move to digital health for data collection, for our training needs, and for the data analysis for, different data fields as we start capturing it as we go forward.
Thank you, Kamini. Here is also another interesting question related to the broad spectrum before, and now it's going the other way. Somebody's asking if you guys think that there will be a market or a market opportunity to develop a targeted NDM antibiotic for the use, say, in India, something very specific that will target NDM. What do you think? If this is something viable or?
No doubt, we have a very large proportion of antibiotics which are caused by the bugs which have NDM genes, but then we also have a lot of OXA48s and the variants of that. So I am not, and there are not just the NDMs and the OXAs, there are the efflux mechanisms and other mobile genetics elements as well, which contribute to this resistance. So while the NDM, I don't know how the NDM is going to change over a period of time, because depending upon the antibiotics that you use and the other interventions that you will be bringing in, the profile is also going to change. And we have seen it changing, like we don't have any KPCs in our country. India, this thing is very, very different from the rest of India. Profile is very different from the other countries. So I think NDM can be part of the entire the set of genes that we target, but not the only one.
And to add on to what Dr. Kamini said, Francois, while it'll be outstanding to go with directed therapies, right? That's a holy grail. That boom, the patient comes in, you know what the problem is, and you pick and choose the exact drug that matches it. We are some ways away from it. And if you look at the crowded clinical settings that you go through here, and patients are coming in here with very serious comorbidities, etc., it's very hard for even clinicians. The usage pattern is very complex in India to say that this is just one bug and it's NDM1. Their preference is to broad brush. At least today, that's a preference, because they're also under pressure. The comorbidities, you don't know if it's polymicrobial, right? So I think we are still some ways off. I completely agree with the question, multiple questions from your users, that I hope a day will come for directed therapy, but I just don't see it in the immediate near future.
And I also feel that we can't just focus on a gene, it's, as Anand mentioned, it can be polymicrobial infections as well. So that's why we need to take the whole bug into account when we design a therapy.
Yeah, so right.
Yeah, thank you both for the answer. Interesting answer. I'm gonna try to combine a couple of questions here. It's a couple of questions asking that a lot of the new antibiotics that are in the pipeline right now are essentially modifications of existing classes. And a couple of people, maybe 3 or 4 questions related to this, they are asking if there is any efforts or any support for trying to come up with either new natural products or completely new classes of antibiotics or a screening of libraries that you know of or that are being supported right now in India.
Anand, please go ahead.
I can speak as one of 3 or 4 innovators in India, Francois. We, for one, Bugworks, are working on a completely novel class because we realize that just bringing n+1, n+2, n+3 in terms of generation may not cut it. It's just already we are very much into the diminishing return curve. And as the WHO has pointed out, the pipeline looks really bad. The pipeline shows 45 drugs. Out of 45, 10%, that is between 4 to 5, are only novel, right? Which is the big issue that WHO has identified. And you can talk to clinicians all over India. And if you're just going to bring another BLI or aminoglycoside or modified polymyxin, it may or may not cut it. There are at least 2 or 3 different companies I know of, Francois, that are working on novel mechanisms. And the DBT, as part of doing early grant program, constantly wants to support novel mechanisms, not just antibiotics, but they're looking at phages. They're also a big push to go back and look at the rich history of India, to see from natural products, from Ayurveda, which is several thousand years old, whether we can take natural substances which are polypharmacology, right, and somehow bring it into helping with antimicrobials. But yes, the short answer is n+1, n+2, n+3 will not cut it. We need new mechanisms, not easy to find. We know that it's complicated. And then on top of that, you have market issues, right? So we are, it's a little bit uphill, but the Indian government is trying to promote novel antimicrobials, not just antibiotics, not novel antimicrobials as a whole.
Thank you. Very interesting. And
I also want to add one thing here, that while we are waiting for new antimicrobials and absolutely novel and new products, there's no harm in looking at what we already have. Because typhoid, we know that MDR typhoid has actually disappeared, not just from India, from all the countries where we had a lot of MDR typhoid. Now it is sensitive to chloramphenicol, cotramoxazole, and amoxicillin. A few years back, this was not the case. And cotramoxazole sensitivity has come back to many of the other Enterobacteriaceae as well. So while we are awaiting new drugs, it is good for countries to go back to the lab, look at their antibiograms, take help of their microbiologists, and see what other drugs they can use and stop the misuse of broad spectrum antimicrobials.
Keep it reserved, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you guys. Here another question. Somebody is asking Kamini if there is any efforts on ICMR to try to change prescriber behavior in the fight against AMR, because a lot of antibiotic prescribing is probably not the right one.
The Indian healthcare system is very challenging. I mean, we have tertiary care hospitals, and then we have primary healthcare centers, and then we have very unorganized private healthcare sector as well, which is also full of certain physicians who are not even trained in prescribing allopathic medicines. So, I mean, it's a lot of community misuse. I think 80% of the antibiotic use happens in the community, and which is done by the GPs and other non-trained professionals as well. So it is a very difficult task. Most of the times I get asked these questions, but right now our initiative is limited to the tertiary care hospitals, where the burden of usage of broad spectrum antimicrobials is very high because of the ICUs and the very serious patients being admitted there. So slowly we plan to, now that we have 30 hospitals across the country which are trained in antimicrobial stewardship, we hope that in future we will use these centers to train the nursing homes, the small hospitals, as well as the GPs around their area on responsible antimicrobial prescribing.
Thank you, Kamini. Maybe time for one last question. Somebody's asking if you could comment if there is any efforts going on about trying to find vaccines to combat AMR in India.
So vaccines are important intervention. I think if we improve the utilization of existing vaccines, something like a cholera vaccine, typhoid vaccine, and even the flu vaccines, because maximum antimicrobial prescriptions happen in the respiratory infections, in diarrheal diseases, and in UTI. This is what we know from our studies in the community. So if we are able to use our diarrheal diseases and the respiratory vaccines well, I think we will be able to considerably bring down the antimicrobial prescription for these conditions. Other than that, I don't think it is possible to have a vaccine for a Pseudomonas or a Acinetobacter because it's a much more complicated situation.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess we have come to the end of our questions and answer session. The time is over. We still have a couple of questions left. I also want to point out that many of the audience have sent also messages thanking both of our speakers for their passionate engagement on AMR and for their passion during the talk. And I would like to then thank everybody for their questions and comments once more. And of course, thank our speakers, Kamini and Anand, for excellent talks. And now I will defer to Astrid for the closing comments. Thank you so much.
Francois, for hosting it.
Thank you, Francois.
All right, yeah. So I want to join Francois in thanking the two of you for your very engaged presentations and responding to the questions. As Francois said, there is still a number of questions left, and we will share them with you per email in the coming days, and maybe you can provide a few written answers, which we will then share with the audience. And also, Francois, thank you for moderating the webinar and for managing the questions. So today, for once, I cannot announce any future webinars, unfortunately, but I rest assured that we are currently working on several webinars for the coming months. So there will be several webinars coming, of course, until the end of this year, which feels strangely close at the moment. In the meantime, you can always view, as I said, the recordings of over 20 webinars on our website. Most or all of these webinars are still very relevant, so I really encourage our audience to explore these in more detail and also to read a bit in our antimicrobial viewpoints. So all of this you can find via the links on this slide. Of course, we will announce the future webinars very soon. You will find this information on the website, but also you will receive, everybody who registered for a webinar in the past will receive my email updates, so you cannot miss them. That's all from my side. I would like to thank the audience for joining and for asking many questions. And again, thank you to our speakers and our moderator. I hope everybody found this webinar interesting and useful, and that you encourage your colleagues and your wider network to join also in the future. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.